This lecture will serve just as a little bit of an introduction to World War One. I don't think I'm going to talk about every slide, but we'll use pieces of this just to kind of illustrate some of the big picture things. So let's start with why the war matters. So it tends to get lost when we study history because World War II was so much bigger. But I would argue that World War I was more shattering for Europe. And as I talked about in my little intro with the machine gun, the previous 100 years had been just this unrivaled growth and all this optimism, and that just comes to a screeching halt in the 4 years of World War I. It was more horrible than anybody imagined. It just showed this awful side of modern technology. And when it's over, it causes this crisis of confidence and sort of a loss of faith in Western civilization. And really, this brings an end to the world of the 1800s, the imperialism and the relative peace in Europe. And today was born out of the ashes of World War I. So let's start with causes. And really, this is just one of the dumbest things to ever teach about. And so there's four things you can point to. Militarism, everybody competing and thinking they're going to win. Alliances, where, what does one country has a dispute, it's going to get dragged into another. Imperialism, which, that clash of empires led to worldwide tension. And then nationalism, where you feel your country is better. And there were other groups in Europe that wanted their own states in the first place. So if you start with militarism, each side with modern technology felt they had to one-up the other. So there's the Dreadnought, a British battleship. And then, of course, the Germans felt they had to compete. So there you have the 12-inch guns, again. And so here, this is just an example of, and look at these names, right? Like just built for competition. Then this leads to an arms race. And again, you can look at these numbers at your leisure, but what you can really see is just how much, other places are industrializing. And especially look at what's rising. So Britain is declining as a power from 1870, and Germany's rising, and the U.S. is especially rising. Okay. This will kind of skip, except just to talk about Kaiser Wilhelm, who your book will talk about this too, but he was really an inferiority complex and just really wanted to prove himself. And so he just does different kinds of things. Ultimately, what really matters is you have all these competing alliances. So Otto von Bismarck, the head of Germany before in the 1800s, who really helped unify it, he always was very conscious of keeping Germany from getting isolated. Kaiser Wilhelm kind of ditches that system, and just through him being an idiot, he ends up isolating Germany. So it's Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and then Russia, France, and England end up becoming buddies. And so if you look at the system here, does leave Germany surrounded. But ultimately what was going to happen was what affected one country dragged in everyone else. So when the war starts, everybody gets dragged into it. So Italy, when the war starts, bails out of that alliance. But there you go. And so you have the Triple Entente and the Central Powers. Now, you can see just the overlapping. And again, the dates are what they are. Mainly just know that, what affected one country was going to affect everyone. Okay. Imperialism matters too because it led to more areas of conflict for all these countries all over the world. And we looked at imperialism a couple of weeks ago. And it just gives more places where they're going to get tense. Nationalism factors into because it's a combination of you want your country to rock and roll, and what if your ethnic group doesn't have a country, which is what happens in the Balkans. So you can see the challenges for Austria-Hungary, look at all these ethnic groups. And of course, in Serbia, this was a country down here, there were Serbs living in what today is Bosnia. And so there was like independence movements, and actually Sarajevo is where the assassination is going to happen. It's going to start the war. So the Black Hand was this group of Serbian nationalists, and they want their own country. So the Archduke, who's the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, he is assassinated. Now, there's a couple of good stories with this. First, this is one of the, I think, the only famous thing to happen on my birthday, June 28th. But more interestingly is this was actually about 6-7 people were in Sarajevo the day to kill the Archduke. And the first time they actually try to roll a bomb under his car, and they miss, and it gets the car behind, I think, or in front. And so the guards get injured. So so at that point, all the other assassins, including Gavrilo Princip, who's the guy who's going to ultimately do it, they call it off. They're like, okay, we're found out. And so he's all bummed out. So he actually goes to just have a sandwich at a cafe in Sarajevo. Now, Franz Ferdinand, who's the Archduke over here, he felt bad. He wanted to go visit his guards in the hospital, but he didn't have a map or anything. So his driver gets lost, ends up going down a dead-end street. When he starts to make the U-turn, he actually literally stops in front of the cafe where Gavrilo Princip is having his lunch. Cannot believe his good luck. He happens to be 19 years old, and he walks up to the car and kills the Archduke and his wife. So just one of those bad luck moments, and just have your sandwich in the right place. There's the car that he was killed in. And actually in the museum, they also have his shirt. So here again, you can see just a cartoon kind of just fueling all this fire. And these are all these grudges and all these things that are going to cause the war. This mini lecture, I want to just talk about modern warfare and just what World War I changed. Because it did, in fact, change a lot, and it just made this war so much bloodier. So things had progressed a long time since really the other industrialized war, which was the U.S. Civil War. So here's a Civil War cannon. There's a World War I artillery piece. Much, much more advanced, much more powerful, bigger range, more explosive. The Gatling gun, which just barely made an impact in the Civil War. Okay, by World War I, you have the machine gun, which again we talked about already. Okay, and so with these weapons interacting, once the war starts, you end up in a stalemate. So we're going to get into some of these, some of the military stuff here, but it's just literally for 4 years the front just locks. So let's just give you the quick military thing here. So prior to the war, the Germans had developed a plan called the von Schlieffen plan, which was to not go directly at France, but to in fact sweep through Belgium, even though Belgium was neutral. And the idea was to keep Germany from fighting a two-front war with Russia over here and France there. So their theory was knock France out of the war quick, and then, which they had done in 1870. So the key to the plan, though, was to not keep much here and put all your force sweeping. But the guy who succeeded Schlieffen, a guy named Helmuth von Moltke, he got a little nervous and he kept pulling troops just in case the French attacked. And that paid disastrous consequences later. So why do you have a stalemate in 1914? Well, a couple of things. When they ran into each other with those machine guns and the artillery, just nobody knew what to do next. Like they didn't. So the armies got exhausted. The ammunition ran out because they hadn't planned for a war that long, and the production hadn't picked up. There's just so much armies in such little ground, and ultimately you couldn't go around the flanks anymore because you ran into the ocean and you ran into the Alps. And so that was it. So all these plans failed. And then once the plans fail, well, what do you do next? So if you look here, okay, there's the border of France and Germany and Belgium. And so this is the border, and literally the Germans got a little bit into France. They're stopped right outside of Paris. And for the next 4 years, that's your lines. It maybe moves a mile or two. And you spend hundreds of thousands of people dying just to move that as the line. And so just to give you a sense of it, this is just in the last 4 months of 1914, okay, or 5 months, okay? And those numbers kind of speak for themselves. It was just disastrous. So once these lines stabilize, well, what does this look like? Because you've got two armies smacking into each other and you can't retreat. You can't go around them. So the only way to not die is to dig down. And that leads you to your trenches. So early on, the trenches were kind of improvised. So you can see these 1914 trenches. These are pretty slim. You know, they're what they are. And it's literally like a ditch. By 1915 to 1917, they had gotten this perfected. Now, the way it would work is you would have the British frontline trench, you would have your, communication trenches, and then you'd have your second line of trenches, and then going back to the field. These pictures speak for themselves, but this is how you would sleep. And you saw some of this in the clip. I'm going to show you a couple more clips in just a minute. And then here is a crew working one of the machine guns with the gas masks early on. Okay, and then when it was time to attack, they would say you're going over the top. And so in the movie 1917, this is the plot where he's trying to stop this, but stop an attack like this. And these were just ultimately almost always futile. And so you're literally going across into this hellscape of no man's land. And here's the problem. Okay, and again, so if you look, right, you've got belts of trenches. So let's say that you're going on the attack. Okay, so you've got to first make it through their first belt of trenches, and these are surrounded barbed wire. Then, if you have anybody left, you're going to be exhausted. You try to get through the second belt and the third belt of trenches. And again, there's barbed wire in front of these. A new invention hadn't existed, 50 years before. So your first challenge, surviving no man's land. So you go across, okay, machine guns are going to be strafing you, artillery dropping. And so what do? Maybe you make it to their trenches, okay? Then once you get through, you're in the trench. Now what? Can you get enough troops to follow across? Then you've got to break through the enemy's remaining trench belts. And how do you get fresh troops and supplies up? Because communications isn't great doing all that. Now, and this was the vision for the whole war, once you manage to get through the fourth belt challenge, belt of trenches, third belt of trenches, what do? You try to have this breakout. But by then you were so fried and your army was exhausted, this was just not going to happen, which is why the front didn't ultimately move all that much. So this just shows you 1917 locations. So each of these divisions, this is from the part of the front in 1917, has 13 to 16,000 soldiers. Okay, and so just the example, 40, bigger than Kansas City at the time. Okay, and so you've got these three divisions. And how do you fight through this, right? This is just hellacious. So the ultimate symbol of this futility was called the Battle of the Somme. Now, it isn't that there weren't battles before this or there weren't battles after, but this was the one for Britain, at least, that just shocked everybody. So it's from July to November, and they assured people that this was going to be over. They were going to fire 1 million shells, and that is just not what happens. So on the first day, okay, they start on July 1st, okay, and the casualties from July to November, you can see it here, but literally the front moves 6 miles, and it cost them like almost 1 million people. And on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the very first day, I think something like 40,000 British soldiers died. That was more than the entire British Army at the start of the war. Um, and just to put that in perspective, 3,000 Americans died on 9/11. Okay. Another battle, you have the Battle of Verdun. This was kind of going on at the same time. 700,000 casualties, and nothing changes. Again, here you can see the German soldiers. Now, you did have some weapons that maybe tried to make a difference. So you have the tank. The challenge with tanks is, yes, they could break through the trenches, but they are not reliable. So here's some statistics. I had 49 tanks on September 11th, okay, middle of the Battle of the Somme. 17 break down, getting to the front. You have 32 left. 9 break down during the attack. 5 fall into shell holes, and then you get 10 are knocked out by enemy fire. So by the end of one day, you have 8 tanks operational. So just not quite reliable enough yet. But here you can see this is a Mark V tank. Trenches was not at all pleasant. We actually you have some new ailments that show up. So here you can see guy with trench foot, which is when, because if you couldn't change your socks, they would all rot and you're kind of gross, your toes get all gangrenous. Some other things you have. Each in part of breaking that stalemate, people used poison gas, of course. Now, early on, it was chlorine gas, but what you could see. Then mustard gas was a skin irritant. And ultimately, gas doesn't make the big difference because it's not reliable enough as a weapon, because it could blow back on you. But, and there were different varieties we won't get into here, but let's just say it was so horrific they've never used it again in war. Okay, and you can see there what it does. Now, aircraft, again, also not enough to make a difference because they were brand new, but for reconnaissance and scouting. And they actually marketed the aces as like the Red Baron and such as, a way to make some good come out of this war. But again, no parachutes. You can see here some of the shortest life expectancies in the war. The Red Baron, we see images of him today where he's this dashing guy. He was a stone cold killer. They asked him his secret once. He said, "I aim for the pilots." And he ultimately was killed. Now, the Germans also used Zeppelins to bomb, but again, not effective, basically blimps, but it's whatever's going to work. Now, again, early bombers, but this is going to become much more important in World War II. Now, how do you respond then to this total war? So this has effects on the home front, all kinds of things. So poetry matters a lot. Your book is going to talk about some good ones. Dulce decorum est. We will take a look at that this week. And if you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling, the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud, of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest the children of ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie, dulce decorum est pro patria mori. And that's translated as it is sweet and right to die for your country. And actually, Wilfred Owen is the poet of that, is killed during the war. And again, you have letters home. Now, one of the ailments that they had, today we would call this post-traumatic stress disorder, but shell shock. And literally, some people just can't take it and just freak out. And again, we'll look at some clips about this. So you can see. And then on the home front, things change. So lots and lots of propaganda. Won't get into it all, but there is a lot. So it's enlist, you dehumanize your enemy, finance the war, conserve resources. Women matter a lot. This is actually going to help them get suffrage later. and working in the factories. And I guess suffrage is a legacy because it's kind of payback for the women working. The Russian Revolution, which you'll read about, that birth of a communist country. And then this is the treaty the Germans make them sign to get out of the war. Submarines get used a lot. So the Germans are trying to blockade Britain. This is their method of doing it. Okay, the Lusitania is a ship that, although the Germans warned the U.S. it might get sunk, it was a British ship. The Germans sink it, and almost gets us into the war then, but not quite. Then they bring back 1917, submarine warfare again. This does help bring the U.S. And then the U.S. enters the war, and bringing our fresh troops after everybody's gone. Way to think of it is it's like the U.S. like sits out like the first 3 quarters of a hard football game, then shows up with a brand new team while everybody else is exhausted. And then the war ends on November 11th, 1918.